So, welcome each and every one of you to our second class in the Tea and Teaching series as we explore and build the foundations for understanding herbal medicine. Our intention is very much to address herbal medicine as a self-care practice, as a part of daily life and personal growth, wellness, but also to be a space for the deep kind of foundational learning that I would hope would be present for anyone who is wanting to also share the gifts of herbal medicine with their family, their friends, with people professionally. I believe that the calling to do healing work does not always manifest in a professional calling, or in the sense that you have to be labeled and named, as a healer or something. I think actually there's probably more danger in that. I think there is something really important about training people from all walks of life to do healing work. So if I have a secret motive for teaching this series, that is it. It's that I believe that if you're here, you are someone who's called to offer healing work into the world in some capacity. And this is what you've got to know if you want to do that. And I think we do need you to do that. It doesn't mean you have to get a different job. It doesn't mean you have to get a different degree. It may simply mean that holding this awareness as you deal with your coworkers or your family, or walk down the street, holding this awareness will allow you to show up when you are called to be a vessel for healing to flow through. And with that, we are going to begin our discussion of the nature of medicine. And as I did last week, I'm going to begin with some poetry. And before I do that, I'm going to say that one of the big themes of today's class is going to be the idea of concentration. And there are two connotations to the word concentration. There is the connotation having to do with causing the mind to concentrate and become very focused, present, potent, and alive, and able to take in a great deal of information, process it accurately, recall it. There is also the connotation of what you're doing if you're double boil and bubble, double toil and trouble. I'm mixing up my Macbeth here. But if you are boiling something and cooking off the water and getting it stronger and more concentrated, if you are making your cold brew coffee concentrate because coffee is your poison and it's too hot for drinking hot coffee, whatever it is, there's this idea of potency. And poetry embodies and shows us what it's like to concentrate language, and thereby offers us an opportunity to concentrate our minds, and also to receive a very potent piece of information, beauty, power, something like that. And this is very much part of the definition of medicine that we're going to work our way toward this evening. So with that, I'm going to offer you two poems. The first is from a very beloved poet of mine, from Anne Carson. This is from Men in the Off Hours, part of a piece of this book in which she imagines like TV scenes and shooting scripts from various literary figures throughout history. And this is called TV Men Lazarus, and it's the beginning of this series. Director of photography, voiceover. Yes, I admit a degree of unease about my motives in making this documentary. Mere prurience of a kind that is all too common nowadays in public catastrophes. I was listening to a peace negotiator for the Balkans talk about his vocation on the radio the other day. We drove down this wasteland, and I didn't know much about the area, but I was fascinated by the horrors of it. I had never seen a thing like this. I videotaped it, then sent a 13-page memo to the UN with my suggestions. This person was a member of the International Rescue Committee, not a man of TV, but you can see how the pull is irresistible. The pull to handle horrors and to have a theory of them. But now I see my assistant producer waving her arms at me to get on with the script. The name Lazarus is an abbreviated form of Hebrew El-Lazar, meaning God has helped. I have long been interested in those whom God has helped. It seems often to be the case, e.g. with saints or martyrs, that God helps them to far more suffering than they would have without God's help. But then you get someone like Lazarus, a man of no particular importance, on whom God bestows the ultimate benevolence without explanation, then abandons him again to his non-entity. We are left wondering, why Lazarus? My theory is God wanted us to wonder this. After all, if there were some quality that Lazarus possessed, some criterion of excellence by which he was chosen to be called back from death, then we would all start competing to achieve this. But if God's gift is simply random, well, for one thing, it makes a more interesting TV show. God's choice can be seen emerging from the dark side of reason like a new planet. No use being historical about this planet, it's just an imitation. As Lazarus is an imitation of Christ, as TV is an imitation of Lazarus, as you and I are an imitation of TV. Already you notice that although I am merely a director of photography, I have grasped certain fundamental notions first advanced by Plato, e.g., that our reality is just a TV set inside a TV set inside a TV set with nobody watching but Socrates, who changed the channel in 399 BC. But my bond with Lazarus goes deeper. Indeed, nausea overtakes me when faced with the prospect of something simply beginning all over again. Each time I have to raise my slate and say, take 12, or take 13, and then take 14, I cannot restrain a shudder. Repetition is horrible. Poor Lazarus cannot have known he was an imitation of Christ. But who can doubt he realized soon after being ripped out of his warm little bed in the ground that his own epic of repetition was just beginning. Lazarus, take 2! Poor drop. As a bit of salt falls back down the funnel, or maybe my pity is misplaced. Some people think Lazarus is lucky, like Samuel Beckett, who calls him Happy Larry, or Rilke, who speaks of that moment in a game when the, quote, the pure too little flips over in the empty too much. Well, now I am explaining why my documentary focuses entirely on this moment, the flip over moment. Before and after don't interest me. You won't be seeing any clips from home videos of Lazarus in short pants racing his sisters up a hill. No footage of Mary and Martha side by side on the sofa discussing how they manage at home with a dead one sitting down to dinner. No panel of experts debating who was really the victim here. Our sequence begins and ends with that moment of complete innocence and sport when Lazarus licks the first drop of afterlife off the nipple of his own old death. I put tiny microphones all over the ground to pick up the magic of the vermin in his 10 fingers, and I stand back to wait for the miracle. You know, that was long. Kind of all for the end. This is from This is your last poem for tonight. This is from The Essential Rumi, translated by Coleman Barks, another favorite book. And this is a poem called Back Pain. Muhammad went to visit a sick friend. Such kindness brings more kindness, and there is no knowing the proliferation from there. The man was about to die. Muhammad put his face close and kissed him. His friend began to revive. Muhammad's visit recreated him. He began to feel grateful for an illness that brought such light, and also for the back pain that wakes him in the night. No need to snore away like a buffalo when this wonder is walking the world. There are values in pain that are difficult to see without the presence of a guest. Don't complain about autumn. Walk with grief like a good friend. Listen to what he says. Sometimes the cold and dark of a cave give us the opening we want most. I'd love to hear what your thoughts might be about how either of those poems relate to your own definition of what is medicine. What is the nature of medicine? There are no right and wrong answers to this question, and if you don't feel like you have any idea how either of those things relate to the nature of medicine, that is also fine. If you feel like you can't enter the question from those places, then you can absolutely just say, hey, I kind of think, this is, I remember taking, some kind of medicine as a little kid, and or sometimes people like, you only got to drink soda when you had a tummy ache, and so that was kind of like medicine or something. Feel free to enter through personal experience as well. I'd love to hear a thought or two about how either of those poems relate to your idea of what is medicine, or what is your idea of what is medicine. Believe me, I have plenty of thoughts as well of my own that I've prepared, but I want to hear from you guys first. Okay, Kayla says, it is interesting to me because Rumi talks about the darkness, coldness, autumnness of healing. I have always approached medicine with a bit of darkness. Interesting, Kayla. I just told you last week I thought you were on the poison path. Now I'm like seeing more and more evidence of this. Yeah. Nikki says, I feel as though if medicine is to serve its purpose, one must first feel the pain. Yeah, there's that, I think it's an AA slogan, which a lot of times these sorts of things that become sloganized can get distant from their original potency. However, there's something in that little AA slogan of like, you have to feel it to heal it. Even if we think about just the challenges that come with taking pain relievers, that if I was just in a practitioner group on Sunday and we were talking, one of the therapists was talking about how it's a real challenge for him to get his massage therapy clients not to take Advil before their sessions because then their pressure and pain sensitivity is off and he can't calibrate the amount of medicine that he's going to deliver through his hands. Yeah. Okay, anybody can share any other thoughts. So for me, I think there are a couple of things here that relate to the nature of medicine. One is that there are more superficial components to medicine, and then there are deeper components to medicine. And while I believe that it is always a good thing to be able to relieve physical suffering and improve physical functionality in the body or the mind. There's also an opportunity for physical and emotional and spiritual challenges to become an opportunity for transformation. And so certainly that image, the story of both Lazarus, as seen through this TV documentary person, and the moment of transformation being the thing that catches this narrator's attention, the moment of turning from death and decay to new life again. And even when we are not talking about literal resurrection of the body, but when we are talking about a more metaphorical coming back to life after an experience of illness, pain, suffering, grief, loss, it really does feel like that. And so this is part of the lesson here in both of these stories, that one of the functions of medicine can really be to bring us back to life. Nikki says, the switchover in the first poem reminds me of opportunity to see healing as a whole picture and medicine as a segment, not the end. This also reminds me of the tarot, the death card, one of my favorites. Yeah, yes. Because most people, if you ever learn to work with tarot, right, there are sort of like some of the cards that are scary. And so you quickly have to form a relationship with the scary card. And the death card is one of those where you have to learn, if you're going to have the courage to deal with this deck of cards, you have to learn to see death as a transformation, an invitation of transformation, as well as the loss and the letting go that is inherent in that. Yes. Okay, so this helps us to segue to the first piece about medicine. So as I wrote a little bit in your pre-reading for today, the first definition for the word medicine that really stood out to me, I'm pretty sure I heard this at the Mythic Journeys conference the first year that it was held, which I think was maybe 2004 or something like that. And somebody said, medicine is anything that has power. And this was emerging out of a more indigenous use or understanding of the word medicine. As I was researching for today, looking at the etymology of this word medicine, in fact, the word in the English use of like medicine man happened very early. In the early 1800s, people were saying, using this term medicine man. And this was adopted and co-opted by Indigenous people here. As they learned to speak English, they used this phrase to describe shamanic healing practices. And this was not limited to what we think of today as the practice of medicine, having to do with the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of illness. This concept of medicine being anything with power includes and privileges spiritual transformation and things that have spiritual power. In fact, a couple days ago, I posted a poem that I wrote about vultures, and somebody commented on the thread like, hashtag vulture medicine, and like this is really, it's not that the encountering a vulture or thinking about a vulture is going to diagnose, treat, or prevent an illness in the Western material, construction of how this is done. But there is a very real way that encountering a vulture, for me, there's a piece of soul medicine in that. It reminds me of actually death and transformation, like we've been talking about. And there is a particular significance in a way that it speaks to me when I encounter those beings. And so this is something that is still very much in use. And so maybe you have, well, I'll ask you, do you have any sort of medicine in your life that is pretty far outside of, like, oh, I take this vitamin to keep myself healthy, and I take this Shenling Baijusan with additions when my colitis is flaring up, or I take, I take this prescription to help with this illness. Do you have what medicine do you have in your life that maybe is outside of this common definition that people use, that has more to do with medicine being anything that has power? Yoga as medicine, yes. And that works kind of both ways, because there's therapeutic yoga that is can really be prescribed almost allopathically for particular conditions. And then there is the practice as a whole, having to do so much with spiritual growth and practice. Kitty medicine, yes. Walking, yeah. Yes, I think one of you was telling me about terrace medicine, sitting on a beautiful terrace medicine a little while ago. So all of these things. But there is a way that, if we're trying to define these terms for people who I'm sending out into the world to do some healing work in whatever way you are called to, I think we have to be willing to narrow this term a little bit from just anything that has power as medicine, because otherwise we wouldn't need the word for poison. And, it's too hard for me to conceive of Donald Trump as medicine. And undoubtedly this man has power. So, yes, we could do some contortions and like maybe, he's a backwards teacher or something. Yes. Okay. But like, to me, it just stretches this like way a little too far to be a really useful definition. So I've thought about this more, and we're going to have to do some drawing. Okay. So if you have a pen and a paper nearby, I highly recommend that you actually do this with me. I'm going to try to show you, since we actually have the video. Okay, this is so cool. I'm so excited that the video worked. So we're starting with a spectrum. So can you see that line? This is weird because of the delay. Oh yeah, you can. Okay. So we're starting with just this line of a spectrum. And some of you have seen this before, because I've taught before about the idea of the spectrum of poison and medicine, or the spectrum of nourishment. And this is really an idea that has to do with concentration, as we talked about before. That beginning of the word medicine, that med part of the word, has to do with like meditation, which is about concentration. It has to do with this ability to consider, think over. And then there's also that aspect of medicine, like we talked about, that has to do with like the literal concentration and power of a substance. So if we think about this spectrum, on one side, we'll say maybe like, low concentration. And on the other side, we'll say high. And I have to get my notes from this other side. So we might see that like here on this low concentration side of things, you would have like the food as medicine, right? Like part of what happens when you're eating a healthy, balanced diet is that you're getting not only all the nutrients that you need, which you want it to be concentrated enough that you meet your caloric needs, but you don't want it to be so highly concentrated that you are actually overfed and overnourished. We have a lot of challenges relating to overly saturated foods, overly calorically dense, but nutrient poor. So you don't want too high a concentration of any one thing. You want this kind of balance of lots of different constituents. As you start to have more particular needs or stronger need for food to be healing and therapeutic, maybe you start to need a little bit more concentration of particular kinds of compounds. So maybe you have to really push the greens and the berries and the anti-inflammatory foods, and increase the concentration of that. So maybe you're starting to pump up your diet in these certain ways. But we're still on this relatively low concentration end of things. And then, around here in kind of the middle part of the spectrum, you start to get into some herbs, right? Like herbs are not that different from spinach. If you are working with nettles, for example, you're working with raspberry leaf, you're working with these herbs that are primarily nourishing. They're maybe more concentrated in certain nutrients and certain phytochemicals than your spinach would be, but it's not a huge difference. And so you're in kind of this food-like territory where, just like with food, it's generally very safe. We're not dealing with poison of any kind. The concentration is not so high that it's either going to really make you or break you. And then as we continue going along this spectrum, maybe we get toward the plants that have a lot more alkaloids. We get into the plants that have a lot stronger effects. We start getting a little further into the plants that are potentially toxic. We go a little further into plants, or maybe they're not specifically toxic, but if you take too much, you can get some stomach upset. You can actually start to get some side effects. Keep going a little further, and we're into the poisons. And then, keep going a little further, or just kind of in that same general zone, we really concentrate things and refine them so that all we have is one molecule repeated for 600 milligrams. And now we have a pharmaceutical drug. And it's very concentrated, and there is both a lot of potential for strongly moving the physiology in a direction, and there's also, it's quite concentrated, so there's more danger here. So that's this first level of the spectrum, is the concentration piece. And this is how I talked about safety and efficacy and the range of options when we talk about, what are we talking about when we talk about conventional medicine versus herbal medicine? This is a lot of how I spoke about it before. But as I was getting ready for this class today, and partly maybe because I've been reading a lot of Jung, I realized we have to make another line on this diagram and turn this into a quaternity. So now we have another spectrum on the spectrum, and this vertical line is the spectrum of conversation. And you have to forgive me now because this is certainly my theater background encroaching. And this spectrum of conversation has to do with how your approach to medicine and how medicine's approach to you is different, and rightly so, depending on the severity and the extremity of where you are. Hopefully, that's what it's based on. Sometimes it's based on other things, but we can get into that. So down here at the bottom, where there's no conversation, this is like we're in a dire situation and you just got hit by a bus. We're not going to have a big discussion about trying to get informed consent from you because you are unconscious. So the EMTs are going to assume that you give consent for treatment and they are going to take care of you. Similarly, we have Good Samaritan laws in place in most states in the United States, where if someone is passed out unconscious and you are a Good Samaritan, you come and you try to do CPR, and as usually happens with CPR, you break a rib or two, that you cannot be sued for breaking their ribs while trying to save their life, because it is assumed that, they can't consent, and instead of being charged with assault, it is understood that there wasn't a possibility to have a conversation in this really extreme circumstance. So that's one side, one way that medicine can be engaging with you without a conversation. And that would be in this, this might show up backwards on here, so now I have to wait for this screen to catch up and tell me. Oh no, it shows up right. Okay, good. So this part right here is, high concentration, so high focus, potency, intensity of the medicine being applied, and low conversation. The most extreme part of this quadrant is going to be the place where it's an emergency and we just have to do what we have to do. And maybe the risks are high, but the risks are high kind of either way, so we're going to do everything that we can, right? No conversation, high concentration. On this other side, where there's not conversation, this is a kind of a whole other experience. This is what I'm going to call, or what Dale Pendle, our friend from last week, kind of calls like the ground state. And this is a place where we're rather unconscious about our health, and we maybe don't think we're engaging with medicine at all. So there's not a lot of conversation, and there's also just not a lot of concentration. So for example, taking a daily vitamin falls into this place for most people. It's not something they're thinking about or talking about quite a lot. Just, getting regular sleep, if nothing is wrong with it, is sort of falling into this place. Eating a reasonably good diet, but also it's not a particularly therapeutic diet, all of that kind of falls into this. Not a lot of conversation and not a lot of concentration either. So it's a relatively safe place to be, as long as you are self-aware and are able to notice if something changes and goes wrong. As the conversation increases, there are two ways that I think we can conceive of what conversation means when we're talking about herbal medicine. So one thing that conversation means is like dialogue with your providers, making sure that you understand and have active choices in everything that you receive as part of your healing. Talking through your options, informed consent, all of this good stuff. But the magic about herbal medicine is that conversation is not limited to the conversations that you can have with other humans who are helping you with your care. Plants communicate with us, though most of us don't experience that communication in words. There are many plant people who report experiencing these kinds of communications in words. I am not one of them, but I am also not here to debate other people's experiences that are subjective. But it isn't necessary to understand a plant in a human language in order to have a conversation with that plant. Part of what makes herbal medicine so great is that when you take in an herb, it is very likely to have some effect on your digestive process. And kind of like with food, like you're going to absorb certain parts of it and then other parts of it not so much absorb. And there's actually a dialogue that happens between your body and the herbs that you ingest. Whereas in an ideal world, when you take a pharmaceutical drug, generally with first generation drugs, there are now certain drugs that are designed to break down in a certain way at a certain speed at different stages, that those are a little more like a conversation. And actually you can plot those that way on this graph. That's totally fine. But most of the time with a pharmaceutical drug, it's like, well, your levels are here and we want them to be here. So the drug is going to go like that. And we don't expect or want your body to have anything to say about that going differently. We want it to do exactly what we expect. And we're going to monitor the dose carefully, and we've studied the pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics, and we're going to make it happen like that. With herbs, that's not so much the framework, usually. So that's one kind of conversation that can happen and can be elevated. One reason why you might choose to work with herbal remedies in addition to or instead of pharmaceutical remedies is if you want to increase the conversation quotient, because that's what you need for your healing. The other piece of the conversation that isn't necessarily with your providers is the conversation that you have with yourself, with your understanding of a spiritual, something greater than yourself, your place in the world. And this is a little bit about what that second poem was talking about, is that part of medicine is this understanding and appreciation and this opening, right, the cave that leads us to what we want most, into something that is actually greater, bigger, a bigger, better, wilder conversation than we were having before the initiation. That is also part of this spectrum too. So if we get into a place where, and this is where many of my clients, this is where a lot of you guys are when I meet you, is like you're in the lower concentration but high conversation side of the spectrum. So that's this piece. So you're having a lot of thoughts and a lot of conversations with practitioners, with your inner self, with your spirit guides, and with things that come to you intuitively, and all this kind of stuff. Or sometimes you're having a lot of conversations with family members, and having to call out of work and going to lots of doctor's appointments to try to figure out what's happening. A lot of you guys, when I first meet you, are not like super woo-woo. Some of you are. I love all of you. But we're having a lot of conversations. And yet, you're not in a place yet where you're using the really high concentration remedies. So, maybe you haven't started using any kinds of, herbs or drugs or medicines yet, but you're trying really hard to get your diet perfect and as therapeutic as possible. This is this quadrant. When we get over into this quadrant, where it's high concentration and high conversation, this is where, the further we go up to here, the more that this looks like, serious terminal illnesses where people are having a lot of conversation about how are we managing pain, and how are we dealing with organ transplants or chemotherapy. As you come down just a little bit, the conversation is still really high, but maybe not quite as much concentration as those pharmaceuticals. This is where if you're working with herbal medicine, you really need a practitioner. So these are like my people with chronic illness who have been working with some amount of, pharmaceutical drugs, but they want to include herbs, or they want to get off certain drugs, and now they're trying this. Even if the concentration is a little lower, it's still relatively high on the spectrum. And we're going to keep the conversation high, both within your body, within yourself, and then also with your providers, ideally. The real danger in working with medicine, whether this is, how you're working for yourself, and with your team of support, or if you are a provider and a practitioner, the challenge and the problem comes when you are not in the right quadrant that the person needs to be in. So when really everything is pretty good, and it's like we actually have a pretty good ground state, and we should be in this quadrant with relatively low concentration. And some of conversation is always good, but we don't need to be all the way up here, with 6 different healers working on us and a huge outlay of resources and a lot of worry and fixation. If we need to be down here and allow other areas of our life to initiate us other than our health, then being somewhere else on this spectrum can be very damaging, or on this graph can be very damaging, right? And if you are in a situation that's pretty dire, or you're really deteriorating, you really need help, and you really need high concentration kinds of things, but you are capable of making decisions, you have enough time to give informed consent, you want to understand and be an active part of your healing. If you're working with a provider who doesn't have the skill of doing this piece, or who doesn't want to be bothered with a patient who asks too many questions, or who seems, not to just obey everything that they say, and you get taken from this quadrant of high concentration and high conversation down to high concentration and not so much conversation, then we're going to really struggle. So a lot of this is about orienting and understanding where you are and what you need, both in terms of the strength of the actual physical things that you are taking in and putting in your body, or the intensity. If this works for body work too, are you getting the right concentration of body work? This works for psychotherapy. Are you getting the right amount of titration? Is your therapist kind of keeping things manageable for you, or are you getting totally blown out and flooded every time that you go in and not having enough conversation and time to digest? This model works pretty much for any kind of healing modality, I think. That's a really bold thing to say based on how relatively recently I thought of this. I don't know, we'll have to test it out. I take that back. Test it out with me and let's see if it does in fact work that well. I have some more thoughts about the dark side of each of these pieces, but I think this is a good place to pause and hear what's coming up for you, because that was a lot of information dumping. So tell me, how is this hitting you, and how do you locate, if you want to share, how might you locate yourself, whether now or at another point in your life, kind of on that graph, or within that quaternity? Where do you find yourself? Okay, would being on any sort of pharmaceuticals take you to the high concentration end of the spectrum? For example, antidepressants and birth control pill. Well, it will be a higher, it's relative, so it will be a higher end of the spectrum of concentration than stinging nettles, but it would be, in some way, you might see it as a lower end of concentration than, let me think of a good one. Then, if you were making opium poppy, if you were gathering opium poppy latex, and, this painstaking process, and making, I don't know, laudanum or whatever that preparation is, theoretically, those two things would be lower concentration than that particular plant-based preparation. So it's relative. But I think I would place both birth control pills and antidepressants in, they're on this side of the line, they're on the high concentration side. They're not all the way at the end where, even prednisone or, immunosuppressant drugs, then certainly chemotherapy, they're not that far. But they're here enough that most of the people in my world who use those things, in order to feel comfortable with them, they need a high amount of conversation, because they want to use them consciously and effectively. So they want to make sure that there's enough conversation to match, and they're not falling into a place of just doing it because, well, everybody just takes the pill. And so of course that's what I'm going to do. Usually the people that are in my world also want the conversation to match. Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah, and you may notice this, this was not in your question, so it may not be coming from you, but I think I'm just sensing that there could be someone out there wondering, like, is there good, bad anywhere in here? Like, is there good and bad? No, this isn't. This is not this is not like high concentration is bad and low concentration is good, or conversation is good or bad. It is not, there isn't a value judgment on where you are in here. There is only a sense of, am I in the place relative to these two axes where I can get what I need based on my situation and my personality? Nikki says, I think the conversation piece of the graph helps me to locate myself. Sometimes I want a lot of different ways to heal, but sometimes that actually brings down my ability to engage in conversation. Yeah, this idea helps self-correct, to be clear on the space that I need to be in. Oh, good, good, good. That's what I hoped that it might be able to do, that we could ask. And sometimes all you need to know, and usually you can find this intuitively if you ask it this way. Sometimes all you need to know, you don't have to know exactly where you are. I mean, it's just a thinking concept or construct. There's no like way to measure yourself and know exactly where you are anyway. But there's a sense of like, do I need more conversation to feel comfortable about this choice I'm considering for my health? Or do I need less conversations about what I'm eating and what I'm drinking and like how many times a week I'm going to bar class or whatever? Do I need less focus on this in my life? Do I need it to drop into more of a place of routine and unconscious being rather than something I'm talking about all the time? Or do I feel like I want to bring in more conversation by engaging a different relationship to the kinds of highly concentrated substances I'm using? So, I brought my my medicine with me to class, and this is one of the ways that you can deal with concentration in herbal medicine that is so cool, is by creating a complex formula with lots and lots of herbs in it, so that on one hand, you have a lot of potency, but the concentration of each herb is relatively small. And there is a conversation happening inside this bottle between, I don't know, how many herbs do I have in here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So there are 14 beings in here having a conversation. And then when I ingest this remedy, we're already, even if I never talk to anybody about it, which I don't recommend, but we're already in that part of the quaternity, because there's a lot of conversation happening in the bottle. The conversation is going to continue when I take the remedy, and the concentration is relatively high because we're dealing with herbs that are fairly powerful, because this is something that I take when I am on the edge of having an ulcerative colitis flare in a particular way. So it's not something that I take simply as part of a regular maintenance. It is something that feels very much like medicine to me when I need support. So so you can always just ask, do I need more conversation, less conversation? Do I need more concentration or less concentration? Kayla says, sometimes I'm less aware about the plant communication just because it's more subtle and building. I would like to be more mindful of this process with herbs. It's helpful to think about the conversation of many herbs working together. Yes, yes, it is. It's a little mind-blowing and cool, but yes. We are going to get into the plant communication piece. I should have known this so that I could tell you guys what... oh, and I have this good Jung quote that we get to do in a second too. I should have pulled this other thing up to make sure I knew exactly what we're doing next week. But I think, yeah, okay, so next week we're going to talk about, so Kayla, we're going to talk about this more next week. Next week we're talking about the energetic, biochemical, and spiritual realities of herbs. So we're going to go more specifically into that idea of the conversation, because each of these different ways of relating to herbs is kind of a different, it's almost like plugging into the conversation in a slightly different way. Like, are you reading the body language? Are you hearing the intonation? Are you taking the literal meaning of the words? It's kind of like that. So we're going to get to do that next week. Oh, Nikki, yes, it's as if the herbs can show us how to communicate with them by witnessing how they do it. Yes, yeah, it is. I just had a conversation with and actually, Sarah, I don't know what you go by online. I know two names for you. I think I had a conversation with a wonderful podcaster about this, and we were talking about the way that herbs reveal themselves to us through metaphor, and once I have that, I'll post that link so that you guys can hear that conversation between me and Sarah about the conversations we have with herbs. Like, get as many meta conversations going as we can. Okay, so this is what I have to share for today. I think having this framework is really all that we need in order to talk about medicine right now. And next week, we're going to get really deep into the herbal part of this. So on the 19th, we're going to talk about the energetic, biochemical, and spiritual realities of herbs. And that's a different day of the week than what we've been doing. So let me just double check what day of the week that is going to be. That is on Wednesday, the 19th. So we'll be here at 7 o'clock Eastern, again, the same time, but on Wednesday instead of Tuesday next week. So any last questions, thoughts, anything that you wish to share? And I'm going to meanwhile read this beautiful little piece from our buddy Carl. So this is in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and he's talking about a psychic state, but I believe we can also apply this to a physical state. Jung was a psychiatrist. He was, as all psychiatrists are, even still to this day, is trained first as a medical doctor, so he worked with the body in his training, even though ultimately he came to work primarily with the mind and the psyche. So here's what he says about his own practice of medicine. My aim is to bring about a psychic state in which my patient begins to experiment with his own nature, a state of fluidity, change, and growth in which there is no longer anything eternally fixed and hopelessly petrified. I'm going to read it one more time because sometimes Carl's a little complicated. My aim is to bring about a psychic state in which my patient begins to experiment with his own nature, a state of fluidity, change, and growth in which there is no longer anything eternally fixed and hopelessly petrified. And this, my friends, I think is as good a definition of medicine as any I have ever seen. Okay. All right, darlings. I will stay on for another minute or two if we have any questions or pieces that we want to check in about. Otherwise, I will look very much forward to being with you next Wednesday. And we're going to be talking about the energetic, biochemical, and spiritual nature of herbs and how they work and what these things mean, and is it real and what's not real, and like what's woo woo and what's the, you know, science and this and that, and how do we deal with all these, the multiple perspectives that come along with working with herbs. And I'm going to give that my very, very best shot, and we'll see how it goes. Okay. All right, everybody. So good to be with you. Once again, thank you for your attention and your concentration. This is absolutely the most powerful resource and currency that you have to spend. I want you to think about it consciously. Use it as consciously as you use your money, or as you share your gifts with people. The way you spend your attention is absolutely critical, and I am so honored that you spent any amount of it here with me today. And if you wish to follow up on today's class, you can come to psycheandsoma.com. All of the classes, once the series is complete, will be listed there. Their replays will be there. Oh my goodness, I forgot to turn off that phone. And that's as good a sign as any that it's time to say goodbye. And of course, if you are in a place where you personally are in need of a lot of concentration and a lot of conversation, that part of the quaternity is very much where my work lives. And I always have room for new people, and if you need some support and some help, you can absolutely reach out to me through my website or email, whatever would be helpful, and we can talk about it. So with that, have a beautiful night, and I will see you next week.